Hello everyone, this is Ben, and in today's video we'll be attacking or criticizing, or essentially the goal today is to demonstrate that Fideism is wrong, to argue against it. So the first question is, what is Fideism? Fideism is this idea that emerged, as best I understand the story. The French Revolution was, 1789, was sort of when atheism kind of hit the scene big. It was always around, it was always a thing, but it was the French Revolution when atheism kind of hit the world and became a cultural force. And then the ideas that were part of that sort of, I guess we'll use the German word zeitgeist, were pretty much a thing in France and England, and then it makes its way to Germany in the 1800s. And then German theologians, I think they took sort of a pietist approach to apologetics. And what I mean is like how they know Christianity is true. And we won't go into that in this video. But essentially, German theologians in the 1800s created Fideism as sort of a response to atheism. And they created some other stuff too, but we're just focusing on Fideism in this video. And Fideism is the idea that you're not a real Christian unless you believe in Christianity without any evidence whatsoever. It's the idea that blind faith is the only real faith. It's a virtue. And so to ask a Christian to prove God exists, or to prove that Jesus rose from the dead, or that the Bible's the Word of God, is to ask a Christian to, it's actually immoral to do that, So under a fideist perspective, if you have proof of what you believe as a Christian, and you believe it on the basis of evidence and reason, then you don't have faith. And just Fideism, the word goes back to, I think fidelis is the Latin root of our English word faith. So it's a Latin word. And so we'll get into some of that as we go, because the question becomes what does faith mean biblically? From the fideist perspective, they think that faith biblically is a fideist version of faith. But the fideist version of faith is belief without evidence, and that is a high moral virtue. So one of the famous defenders of this perspective is actually a Dutch philosopher by the name of Soren Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard said his view was you don't really become an authentic person until you believe without proof. That's when you finally exercise your free choice and free will, and you're not just a follower. You're actually someone who thinks for yourself, and that's what the whole leap. So they took the idea of believing in something that you have no reason to believe in, and they turned it into a virtue. Whereas in the past, that would normally really just in life, and even today, people always see that as that's what crazy people do. Crazy people, if you think that I remember I was doing work for one lady, and she got in her mind that the weeds were going to take over her yard and kill all her grass, and there was no evidence of that. The weeds had been pretty much at a steady where they'd always been for years, so there's no reason for her to think that. But she just decided that she was afraid of it, and she went out there and sprayed her grass with 2,4-D, which is a weed killer that the grass will tolerate. And so it says on there you can that you can spray it on your grass and it won't hurt your grass. But this herbicide, the grass is not completely tolerant of 2,4-D. You spray enough 2,4-D on your grass, you will kill it. So she went out there and sprayed it, and she saw improvement in the weeds in her yard, a drastic improvement. She was instead of being excited, she was really troubled by the fact that there were still some weeds. And so she was counter evidence. She was going against the evidence there. The weeds hadn't changed for years and years and years and years and years. She does something and the weeds get better. And so she concludes the weeds are going to take over my yard. that was a leap beyond the evidence that she made in what she believed. And so she went out there and sprayed it again way sooner than you're supposed to, and didn't go by the directions and just sprayed the snot out of it and killed all her grass, or massive sections of it. So she was trying to solve an imaginary problem because of her fears of this catastrophic takeover of her yard, and she was trying her best to solve this imaginary problem, and she ended up creating a real problem. So generally people would say, like, that was irrational of her. I don't know if I'd say crazy. It was a little touch of the crazy, a crazy thing she did, but I don't know if I'd say she's crazy. Whereas, when we think of someone being crazy or insanity, we think of, like, I remember I was talking to this one guy who came by my church years ago, and he was dead certain that he didn't have to eat anymore because he had a god on his head, and he's the only person that can see it. Everybody has a god on their head, and that's why he doesn't need to wear clothes or eat anymore. He has no evidence for any of this, and so generally speaking, this man is checking the boxes for being insane or crazy, although they would probably use a different term, professionals. But in the common parlance, yeah, the man's crazy. He's a crazy man. He thinks he doesn't have to eat because he can see gods on people's heads. And he doesn't need clothes either. Generally, people who believe things that they have no evidence for are crazy people. Fideism explicitly defines, directly, as clear as crystal, defines Christian faith as exactly that. Believing without any evidence. But what they do is they say, this is a virtue. This is the real faith of Christianity. It's the real strength. You're not an authentic, real person. You're just a crowd follower until you make this leap of faith. And it's become a big part of Christianity. And here I am very invested in Christian apologetics and giving people good evidence, good reasons for why Christianity is true. And yet the Fideists would say that, like, you can't do that. Not that it's wrong for me to do that, but it's impossible. So, like, here's the thing, like, okay, here I am, I've got good arguments, sound arguments that make it really, you would be irrational not to believe in God on the basis of this good reasoning. So, like, the Fideists would say, I don't have those arguments fail. They don't say that, like, oh, I'm not a good Christian because I believe on the basis of good evidence and reason. They would say I don't have it. So one of the interesting things that you get from Fideists is they will argue against Christian apologetics, and they will oftentimes take the atheist line or play the atheist. So, like, you'll give them good evidence of the resurrection, and they will string out all the great atheist arguments against the resurrection. So one of the weirdest things about Fideism is that it's very close to atheism, or at least agnosticism. Atheism technically would be a rejection of the existence of God, whereas agnosticism would be a rejection of knowledge about whether or not God exists. It would just be uncertainty. But the way most people use the word atheist, it kind of includes agnostic under the, like, atheist umbrella. And it's not really important for us right now to, figure out, we don't need to worry about those words. But, like, my point is, Fideism is not very far from atheism. Because, especially if I make good arguments for God's existence, then people will be straight up, as a Fideist, telling me that, like, I don't have it. I remember one man, this was a man, like a small group leader in my church, like, from when I was growing up, and he was much older by this point, and he, what he did was, there was this documentary on the Discovery Channel about where Stephen Hawking was going to try to figure out if God exists. And the girl, one of the teenagers had watched it, and she was talking about it. And the documentary had argued that there was proof that God didn't exist on whatever Stephen Hawking had said. Obviously, I'm going to disagree with whatever it is. I mean, I've read his book, one of his books, and listened to stuff he has to say, and he can be pretty bad on some stuff that's outside of his field, but that's not important right now. But like, he's passed away now. But like, the girl was saying, he didn't disprove God's existence. Well, this, Sunday school teacher just immediately said this. This is what he said. Well, you can't prove anything about that stuff, about God's existence. You can't prove anything about that. You just have to take that on faith. Okay, so that's just an example of someone just straight up Fideism. It's so wonderful when you believe in God without evidence. That's the way. You can't prove it one way or the other. Presuppositional apologetics is sort of something. It's sort of a Fideist argument, although it attempts to be a different form of apologetics. So it kind of needs to be in its own camp, but it's very close to Fideism, and I won't address it in this video. But the thing about presuppositional apologetics is like they sort of make a logical case that like you have to presuppose God's existence without evidence, but then they sort of give their reasoning. They will do this whole weird switching of hats where they will argue against classical Christian apologetics, good sound arguments for God's existence. They will take the atheist perspective and argue against those arguments. And it'll be very weird because you have this Christian guy who's a presuppositional apologist, and all of a sudden he'll sound like, a famous atheist when it comes to Christian apologetics. And you're like, I feel like I'm listening to Richard Dawkins right now. This is everything he would say, or some one of these atheist guys. So hopefully that kind of sets up the whole Fideism question. So like, what I want to do at this point is like get into the top arguments in favor of Fideism. Okay. Basically, they boil down to a few. One philosophical argument that's like primarily just philosophy based. Another one that sort of it says that like apologetics contradicts the gospel. And another one that says apologetics contradicts particular Bible verses, specific Bible passages. And essentially, Fideism, in my experience growing up, I was very accustomed to hearing it. And like, the argument was often that you are sinful for even wanting proof. That means there's something wrong with you, that you have I remember I heard one pastor who like, he grew up with me, and so he came from that same Fideist mindset, and like, he was still locked in it, even though, here we are, at that point we were getting close to 40, and I'm 40 now, and it's like, he still believes that, So he went through with a psychoanalysis of people, and he actually labeled someone who wants proof of Christianity as having a mental problem. And he laid it out in a sermon and made it very clear that that's a mental problem. You have, and he like was very specific and technical with exactly what mental problem you have. So like, in other words, like he's saying you are crazy for wanting proof, and this is a specific type of insanity. This is a psychosis you have for wanting proof, and it's just like blowing my mind, because I'm like, I think the person who believes in something without any evidence is the person with the psychosis, the person with the insanity, the person with the weak grip on reality. Okay, let's be real. We don't know if it's true if we don't have any reason to believe it. Okay, so that being said, let's look at the arguments in favor of Fideism. Now, Soren Kierkegaard probably is, he made this argument, and it's the top argument. And what he does is he tells a story of like a man who wants to figure out what he believes. And so he goes and he studies philosophy, and he earns PhDs in philosophy and spends years and years and years, learning all of the arguments for and against and all the rebuttals of the arguments, reading mountains of books about God's existence. And then he wants to learn whether or not, Jesus really rose from the dead and is Christianity true. So he earns multiple PhDs in different fields of history. And, he learns all of that evidence and reads through all the rebuttals, and he's learned everything. And so then finally, at the age of 90, he can give his life to Christ. And so this is the top argument against Christian apologetics from the Fideist perspective, that apologetics takes too much time, and effort for anyone to ever become a Christian. How can anyone be expected? How can the 6-year-old child in church on Sunday who hears the gospel and decides he believes it, you telling me that person's irrational? And so you're telling me that a person has to become, has to study and read everything before he can really become a Christian? And I think we all recognize that the gospel is presented in such a way that it's urgent, you need this. And so it doesn't really make sense for you to have to take forever to, get to a point where you can believe it. That's not really how the gospel works. And so the argument here is that this is really the idea that you would have to, study and study and be 90 years old before you can become a Christian contradicts sort of the core ideas of the gospel. The gospel has this sense of urgency. The message of Jesus Christ, that all people are sinners and deserve to go to hell, and that Jesus Christ has died in our place for our sins. And if we believe that, then we will be saved from our own evil, from the punishment of hell and sin itself. That's the gospel, and it's very, it has a sense of urgency, and it just doesn't fit with the gospel. There's this sense of fit. Christian apologetics just doesn't seem to fit with the gospel. So the problem, this is the biggest argument in favor of Fideism. And it is, I'm just going to go ahead and lay it out, that it commits a basic logical fallacy. So the logical fallacy that's going on here is what's called a faulty dilemma. A faulty dilemma occurs when you give someone two options and you expect them to choose between the two options. So what Soren Kierkegaard's argument is saying is that you either have studied absolutely everything and have what in epistemology is called an indefeasible justification for your knowledge. Your justification for your knowledge is so strong that it can't be defeated. There's nothing that can defeat it. Or you believe for no reason at all, fideistically. And so that's a big either or. A person can have evidence for something that makes it more probable without going to the point of having indefeasible, I've studied every possible way that this could be shot down. I've studied every argument pro and against the resurrection and the Gospel of John. And, I've analyzed it and scrutinized it, and I'm 90 years old, and now there's no way it can be wrong, so I believe it. That's setting up a huge false dilemma. It's like if I asked you, are you a fascist or a communist, and you've got to, and what are you afraid? Are you avoiding the question? Are you a fascist or are you a communist? And it's I'm not a fascist or a communist. There are other things I could be. When I was a kid in the lunchroom, they would always ask you if you wanted to have sex with Freddy Krueger or the lunch lady. And then if you said, whoa, the lunch lady, because then it would be Ben wants to marry the lunch lady, and it was just a little child's joke, but it's a false dilemma. One of the common ones you see online is people will post these false dilemmas where they're like and share my social media post, or else you love the devil, or else you're going to hell when you die if you don't like and share the post. And it's that's a false dilemma. I could not be going to hell and not like and share your post. false dilemmas get set up all the time in life. They're very common, especially when there's an abusive situation. One of the things I've been, listening to recently is abusive ministry situations where the pastor essentially puts him. What always happens, historically, this happened with the Catholic Church. It always happens is the leadership of the earthly church organization equates what they want you to do with what God wants you to do. And therefore disobeying like the preacher of your church or the Pope or whatever is equivalent to disobeying God. And the thing is, what if it's possible that I don't either obey you in God or disobey you in God? What if it's possible that I could obey God and disobey you? What if there's a third option that's hidden here? The biblical example is, of course, when the Sadducees come to Jesus with there's multiple biblical examples really, but they come to Jesus with this woman was married according to Jewish law to 7 brothers, and it was all scripturally correct, mandated, so in God's word. So therefore, in heaven, who's in the afterlife, whose wife will she be? Because all 7 brothers had her as wife. And then Jesus introduces an additional option that they haven't considered, a different way of seeing marriage. So in the afterlife, because the Sadducees were arguing that there's no afterlife, and what they're saying is if there's an afterlife, then it has to be one of the 7, and the only other option is that there's no afterlife. And Jesus says, no, there's another option that you haven't considered. Where there is an afterlife, but it's not the way you envision it. Soren Kierkegaard's argument is that you'd have to be 90 before you can give your life to Christ. The flaw in that reasoning is that you don't have to have studied that much. So for example, social scientific research has shown that most people who come to faith in Christ and whatever they believe, so if they're a Hindu, if they're a Muslim, or if they're an atheist, whatever it is you believe that because the parents and teachers in your life, the people that teach you everything in life, that you go to school, your parents teach you your morals, they teach you how to use the potty, how to drive, everything we get from parents and teachers. And we take so much information and we justify what they teach us as rationally justified knowledge. We ground that, we justify that in the fact that we know that person well and that person's testimony is reliable. And so we base a lot of what we believe on testimony of other people. So when the people that you know and respect and look up to in your life are telling you, Muhammad is God's prophet, or, don't eat beef or that'll be bad karma, or accept Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior. People, generally speaking, according to social science research, believe those things on the basis of the testimony of the people in their life that they most know and respect. And what I'm here to say to you is that is not the same thing as just taking a leap of blind faith without any evidence. People have some rational justification. Is it indefeasible? Well, obviously it's not indefeasible because the Muslim kid's parents told him that Muhammad is God's prophet, and the Christian kid's parents told him something else, and the atheist kid's parents, or maybe his friends or whoever, told him something else, and the Hindu kid's parents told him something else. So it's not indefeasible, it's not impossible that you're wrong, but at the same time, you're not just taking a blind shot in the dark here. You're going on the basis of the best information you have as a child, the people in your life that you most know and respect. So what I'm saying is, knowledge can have different levels of justification. So let's just define knowledge in the classical philosophical sense. We won't worry about the interesting additions to the definition of knowledge that are being debated today, but let's just look at it in the classical sense. It's called the JTB definition of knowledge: justification, truth, belief. So, for something to count as knowledge, first of all, you have to believe it. If you don't believe it, then it can't be said that you know it. So, like, let's say that it's going to rain tomorrow. You can't say that you knew it was going to rain tomorrow unless you already believed that it was going to rain tomorrow. So, the belief is kind of obvious. Truth is the second component of the definition of knowledge. That, like, it also has to actually be true that it rains tomorrow. For you to really say that, like, I knew it was going to rain tomorrow, it has to actually rain tomorrow. If it doesn't actually rain tomorrow, then you didn't really know it was going to rain tomorrow. You just believed it incorrectly. But there's an additional component of knowledge which is called justification. And justification is like, what did you ground this belief on? What was the basis of your belief? Why did you believe it? So, like, let's say that, like, you believed it was going to rain because you just guessed, and you're just a lucky guesser. Well, then, you didn't really know it was going to rain. You didn't have knowledge because you didn't have the JT and the B. You didn't have the J. You didn't have the justification. You just kind of guessed. And the point I want to make to you, to whoever's listening, is that the justification we have for our knowledge comes in varying levels of strength. So, justifying your belief in Jesus or Muhammad or whatever on the basis of because your parents told you, and not just because your parents told you, but because you can tell that that's what they believe, and that's what the parents and teachers in your life believe, that is a certain degree of justification. It is not the same thing as a leap in the dark. It is not blind faith. It is not a leap of faith. You are grounding that on the fact that, like, these people who you trust, who have raised you, and who you've learned everything from, that they believe it. And they're telling you you ought to believe it. That is a level of justification that you have. Justification goes through sort of different levels, and there's this question of, like, once it gets to a certain threshold that philosophers call warrant, it goes from being, I have some justification, to now belief in this is warranted. So, like, now I would be irrational to not believe it. So for example, let's say that the weatherman tells you it's going to rain tomorrow, or let's say the weatherman tells you there's a 45% chance of rain. Would you be rationally justified in believing that it's going to rain? Well, you would have some justification because he didn't say 0%, but at the same time, he didn't go above 50%. So, like, I don't know. If you go to the point of, if he says there's a 99% chance of rain, then the justification that you have for believing it's going to rain tomorrow is so strong that you would be irrational to believe it's not going to rain. You know, assuming that the weatherman's reliable. You know, but leaving out the reliability of the weatherman and just assuming that he's perfectly reliable, hypothetically for the sake of our example, then yeah, once you have like 100% chance of rain, you know, from the weather report, then you are rationally warranted in believing that it's going to rain tomorrow, and you would be irrational for rejecting belief in the rain. So, like, there are levels of justification. So I'm going to give you an example to help us kind of break this down. Let's say, this is an example I'll just borrow from an Alvin Plantinga book. He's a famous philosopher. And he gives the example, let's say that, like, this is a hypothetical example, but like you're a college professor at a university, and you have long been known to be basically an enemy of this other professor at the university, and you don't get along with that guy, and you have vandalized his car in the past. You've broken windows and scratched it and keyed it and slashed his tires before, and it's well known, everybody knows it. And then let's say that this fella's tires get slashed again, and that you had said the other day that he's made you so mad that you're going to slash his tires again. And let's say that, like, there's video surveillance of someone matching your height and build and facial hair who looks very much like you slashing his tires. And let's say they're witnesses who, like, say they saw you there, you know, from a distance, slashing his tires. A jury would be rationally justified on the basis of that evidence and warranted in finding you guilty of the crime. And you'll say you have no alibi, you were off work that day. Okay. The jury would be rationally justified in finding you guilty of the crime on the basis of all this evidence. But let's say that you just, on the basis of your memory, know you were mountain climbing the whole day. Or believed yourself to have been mountain climbing. You have memory of the fact that you didn't slash the tires and you were mountain climbing the whole day. The question is, and this is what we have to think about, the jury is rationally justified in believing you slashed the tires. Therefore, are you warranted? Should you, if you're going to be rational, should you also believe you slashed the tires? No. Because your memory is a stronger level of justification than all of the evidence that they have. It's just stronger than everything they have. Now, what we could do is give, in our hypothetical example, we could make their justification even stronger. Like, you know, there's video surveillance up close and makes it real clear that it's you. That would be, then the jury's justification would be so strong that you should really doubt your memories at that point. And so all of this is to make the point that, like, there are levels of rational justification that can go to different levels, and the jury is, all of them are warranted. Like, the jury has crossed the line to the point of warrant, you know, on the basis of what they have. You've crossed the line to the point of warrant on the basis of your memories, and it actually overrules their warrant. But then we could modify the example to a hypothetical of the hypothetical where they have better video surveillance of your face, and then that warrant would overrule the warrant on the basis of your memories. So there's levels of strength of justification that have to be taken into account. And so my point is, there is a grand spectrum of how rationally justified you could be in belief in Jesus Christ. But Soren Kierkegaard's argument ignores that huge, long spectrum of evidence and justification and just says, you either have indefeasible justification that took you 90 years to learn, or you believe it for no reason at all. That is the problem. Because in reality, like with Christian faith, people believe it on the basis of testimony, but then they gain new reasons after that. In fact, it's not just for Christianity. Hinduism, Islam, once people convert, they learn that, like, my religion, like, it really fits with the world and makes sense of the world. This is true for atheism too. And they see a sense of fit. And then the other thing they see, at least with religious views, is there's like sort of a moral, it comes from a morally good source. It's virtuous. So someone virtuous probably produced it. And so they have stronger justification than they did just on the basis of testimony. And that's not nothing, because most religious movements die out. So the few that are around still have some kind of something to them. Now, if you go into Christian apologetics, you can start to learn better and better and better and better and better and better and better. You can start to dig into it and strengthen the level of justification that you have. And, you know, that's wonderful and well and good. So, like, if you start to learn, one of the first things you might start to learn is, like, there's problems with Hinduism, and there's problems with atheism, because if atheism's true, it's like, well, why is anything right or wrong? It's just us here making up what we want to believe. It becomes a problem. You could dig more into that and make a hard-nosed philosophical argument out of that, the better you understand it. Or like with Hinduism, and this whole idea of karma comes across as very racist, and it seems immoral. And once you dig into that, it's like, I don't know, like, maybe Hinduism isn't as moral as it seems. So that's kind of the point. Soren Kierkegaard's argument here really falls apart. But like a lot of the time, people say things. One of the things that you run into in life a lot of the time is people make arguments ambiguously by providing a key premise in an argument without really stating all the premises. So, the example I like to give from South Park, they had these little creatures called the underpants gnomes, and all they do all day is collect underpants. And then step 2 is, we're not sure what step 2 is, but we know step 3 is we profit. And so they're called the underpants gnomes, and they go out and collect underpants. Well, that in logical argument, people do that all the time. They give you like premise 1 of the argument, and they don't give you premise 2, but then they give you the conclusion. Or sometimes they just give you premise 1, and keep it vague is what So like I'll give you an example. Here's an example. Premise 1: people who don't wear socks have smelly feet. Premise 2: Jimmy doesn't wear socks. Premise 3: therefore Jimmy has smelly feet. Now that argument that is the syllogism for the argument. That is a logically valid syllogism, just meaning that if premise 1 and premise 2 are true, then the syllogism, the conclusion must be true. That doesn't mean that the conclusion is true. If the conclusion is true, then the argument is sound. So as long as it's valid, and the premises are more plausibly true than their negations, then the argument is sound. But that's kind of how it works. But like in real life, people oftentimes just give you like one of the premises and then the conclusion. They don't give you the other premises. And so oftentimes they expect you to refute their argument when they haven't actually stated all of their argument. This goes on in life all the time. This is the ambiguous argument problem, the ambiguity fallacy. So there's more than one way to be ambiguous, but this is a big one. So I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about with Fideism. People will say, all I need is the Bible. And I don't need all that apologetic stuff. All I need is the Bible. That's very ambiguous, That is a key premise in the argument, but it's like, where's the rest of the argument? Now, one of the things, sometimes you'll hear people, like especially like big name pastors, like Christian speakers who speak to huge, they're like Christian sort of evangelical celebrity pastors. They will give you the key premise and then not the conclusion, and they'll like want you to draw their own conclusions, and so that gets a whole other level of ambiguity. And they'll state that they've refuted your position, but it's not real clear what their position is or whether or not they really even have drawn a different conclusion from you. They've just given you like a premise. But when someone says, all I need is the Bible, what they're probably really meaning is this sense of fit and this place of moral virtue, which really act as some good evidence that Christianity is true. So, but they haven't like fleshed out what that means, because there's really sort of multiple things in all I need is the Bible. Or they say just have faith. Just have faith is an ambiguous statement in another sense, because it's not that it's one premise in a syllogism and it doesn't have the other premises. The problem with just have faith is that that's just an ambiguous statement you could take multiple ways. So there's other forms of ambiguity where I could say like, President Joe Biden unveils new economic plan, more lies ahead. And there's more than one way to take that. So anyway. I guess we've kind of... Before we move on to the next point, I want to make one more point. Doubt can be an important part of the Christian faith journey. And Fideism really is not good with that. Whereas this whole idea I'm talking about of levels of justification is good with that. So what I mean is like, doubting your faith can be a vital part of like growing in Christ. It can, so like, or just being angry at God sometimes too. But like in Christianity, there's this process called sanctification where like over time the work of Jesus Christ on the cross is applied to you spiritually through the Holy Spirit so that you just don't want to sin so much anymore. And so that helps you overcome temptation. And it's not just a matter of using your free will to just force yourself to not sin, but rather as you read your Bible, pray, gather in worship with other Christians, sit under good teaching. These things will, as you do these things in faith, they will transform your soul so that you just won't want to sin. Over time, more and more. Well, struggling with doubt is one of those disciplines. Dealing with your own doubt as a Christian is one of those spiritual disciplines, just like reading your Bible, prayer, sitting under good preaching and teaching, encouraging and building one another up, worship, like hard work as a Christian. These are all good spiritual disciplines that we do, and as we do them in faith, that the work of Jesus Christ on the cross has brought us into God's kingdom, and therefore we will be transformed. They have to be done in faith. Doubt and struggling with your doubt as a Christian is part of that. It is a spiritual discipline. And the problem with Fideism is it says you should just never doubt your Christian faith. That's wrong. And what I've kind of laid out here is this whole, there's levels of justification. So like, if we look at how the New Testament uses the concept of faith and talks about the concept of faith, how does the New Testament do that? Well, this is vital for us to understand. In the New Testament, what I mean is like the way words are used is really the basis for where their definitions come from. And especially in the New Testament, Christians had a tendency to take Greek words and fill them with like a new meaning. So if you read the word faith in the New Testament, it doesn't come from the Latin fidelis, which is where our English word faith comes from. But it's a translation of the Greek word pisteuo or pistis. Pistis means faith in noun form, and pisteuo is like I have faith. And then the root of both of those is patho. So in the New Testament, that every time you read it, that's the word, and it means like I believe it, but I didn't always believe it. But it's this new belief that I have. So there's another Greek word, pneumitzo, which means like I believe it because I've always believed it because my parents believed it because we just grew up and everyone in my culture believes it. Whereas pisteuo is like I didn't used to believe it, but I've been persuaded. So like it means I've been persuaded to like believe in this. And it's rooted in this concept of patho. Patho was the Greek goddess of persuasion. So patho means I persuade, and patho was the Greek goddess of persuasion. And she would help women persuade a man to marry her. So it's sort of sexual attraction type persuasion. That's what patho. That's the root of the Greek word that in the New Testament, that's always the word that's used because the New Testament was written centuries before the English language even existed. Especially in its modern form, it's over 1,000 years. Okay, so like it's written in Greek. Now, so for example, the Greek word for God refers to like Zeus and Athena and Patho, and these different gods that they believed in, Hades and Poseidon, yada yada. And if we look at Acts 17, you see Paul addressing Athens at the Areopagus, and it's the council that like decides if they want to build a statue to a new god, and they're thinking that maybe Paul is preaching another god for them to add to their list of gods. And what Paul does is he comes in and he uses their concept of God, but he begins to redefine the word God for them, to fill it with a new meaning, to use it in a different way. And Christians, especially in the New Testament in general, does that a lot. It takes Greek ideas that have a Greek context and a Greek meaning, and then it fills them with like a new meaning. Like the Greek concept of charity or grace had a meaning, but the Christians kind of took it to another level. Or the Greek concept of love, agape, in the New Testament, Christians very much took that to a whole other place. They sort of took that idea and ran with it and built on it and expanded on it. And so Christian agape in the New Testament doesn't really mean the same thing that agape means in the Greek language in general. So they did the same thing with pisteuo, pistis, peitho, faith. So how did they use that word in the New Testament? What does faith mean from a New Testament perspective? Well, first of all, to say that you have faith in Jesus or in something means that, like, you believe it. You intellectually agree that it is true. So for example, if you were to say that I have faith that it's going to rain tomorrow, that's because you actually believe it's going to rain tomorrow. If you didn't actually believe it's going to rain tomorrow, then you can't be said to have faith. But faith is more than just intellectual assent. It's also you like that it's true. You want it to be true. There's a desire aspect to it. So for example, let's say that I'm a skateboarder and I love to go skateboarding. Let's say that I believe, on the basis of the weather report, that it's going to rain all day tomorrow. And I don't want it to rain. It's not what I want. Then let's say that I intellectually assent that it's going to rain. I believe it's going to rain. Well, then do I have faith that it's going to rain? No, because I don't want it to rain. So to have faith in something doesn't just mean that you believe it to be true, but that you also want it to be true. Okay? There's another component of faith that you don't just have faith in something because you want it to be true, but also you have to really be putting your eggs in that basket. You have to really, there has to be a confidence. There has to be like a trust that you're actually putting your confidence in that. So, like, for example, my mother had a car that she would drive she drove it across the country to Louisiana one time. And I believed that the car would get her there. And I wanted it to get her there. But it wasn't really me that was riding in the car. I wasn't putting my confidence in it. Nothing I was doing was going to be affected by that. Later, she gave me the car, and then I took a trip to Florida in the car. So I was now trusting in the car, or putting my confidence in the car. So to say that you have faith in it means that, like, not that you're trusting it that it works, but that you're trusting that it works for something you need it to work for. That you're, so like you don't have faith in the chair just because you think the chair will hold you up. You have faith in the chair when you actually sit in the chair. So it's not just intellectual assent, there's also this confidence factor. So what this means is that faith is very much an either or. You either have faith or you don't. You can't. There's no spectrum here. So, like, it really is a dilemma when it comes to faith. You either have faith or you don't. So, like, I either have faith in Jesus or I do not have faith in Jesus. Because of these added components of, like, desire and trust, putting my trust in really counting on this thing, I can't, have like a 62% faith in Jesus. I either have faith in Jesus or I don't. And so what that means is there is a distinction between, like, faith and your confidence level in your faith. So, like, so the example I want to borrow from a lady philosopher whose name is eluding me. I think it's Liz Jackson. She's talking about this. As her example she uses is, let's say that you need it to rain tomorrow for something you're going to do. I mean, you're a farmer, and you're going to take a road trip instead of, I don't know, watering or whatever it is, because you have faith that it's going to rain tomorrow, and you're kind of counting on that. And let's say that the weatherman says there's a 100% chance of rain. Okay, so you have faith that it's going to rain, and you're counting on it, and you're totally putting your butt in that chair. And you want it to rain. You need it to rain. Let's say that you check the weather later in the day, in the afternoon, and they've dropped it from 100% chance of rain to 80% chance of rain. You would still be rationally justified in believing that it's going to rain, and you would still have faith that it's going to rain, because you're still putting your confidence in that. You're still putting your butt in that chair, and you still want it to rain, and you still actually believe it's going to rain. But your confidence level has gone down because you went from 100% certainty, or confidence to 80%. And so, as a Christian, your confidence level in the truth of Christianity could get very low, maybe down to 51%. And you'd still have faith in Jesus Christ. So, maybe something could happen in your faith journey. So for example, maybe you just believed in Jesus on, as most people do, on the basis of testimony. And then maybe, you saw the sense of fit and the moral virtue of Christianity. And so you were pretty, your confidence level was pretty high, and you had faith in it. Let's say that, it turns out the pastor of your church and your parents were all secretly devil worshippers, and, molested children, and all the people you looked up to. That would lower your confidence level, because they were a part of your rational justification. And let's say that, you go to the coffee shop and you meet up with some, atheist friends, or, maybe at the university, and they point out to you that, really the Bible doesn't make sense, and it doesn't have a sense of fit, and they make some arguments, and that the Bible's immoral, and so, maybe their arguments, you're not sure about them, but the bottom line is they seem like there's something there, and so your confidence level could go down, okay, because of those things. And maybe you get down really low to wondering if I should stop having faith in Jesus. Maybe you're down to 51% or maybe 54%, I don't know. We can't really put an accurate number on these things. But the point is that that can be part of your journey as a Christian. Those struggles, those doubts. But the whole time you still are a Christian, because you can't really have 51% faith in Jesus because of these other factors. You either have faith in Jesus or you don't. Now, that being said, you could, in that situation, maybe study the Bible more accurately, and then find out that your atheist friends you met up with were wrong, and the Bible is morally virtuous, and I've learned more about what it really says, and I've got more knowledge about it now, and maybe you could learn that these sense of fit problems aren't really sense of fit problems, and maybe you could learn that atheism actually has some big problems, and maybe you could even go beyond that. And, maybe that'll bring you, back up to 60-something% confidence level. And, then maybe you could go and, learn some good arguments for God's existence, and it's okay, these atheist friends of mine are definitely wrong, because God definitely exists. And it's that's pretty big, that'd bring you up a lot higher. And so, all of that being said, that whole journey can be just part of what it means for you to be a Christian. And to walk with Christ, and for Christ to transform you spiritually, because this spiritual transformation process involves Jesus digging into who we are and what's going on with us, with things that we don't realize are issues. So, for example, with the woman at the well, Jesus, Jesus asked the woman for some water from the well, and she's like amazed that he's talking to her. She's a Samaritan woman. And he says, "Oh, if you knew who I was, you'd ask me for living water." And then she seems to sort of mockingly say, "Where do you get that living water? Give me some." And so the first thing he does as soon as she says, "Give me some of that living water," is he immediately asks her questions about what's going on in her life. And so he is giving her the living water right there. He's transforming her. He's digging into her soul. She asked Jesus Christ for some of that living water, and he immediately started doing it. She immediately got some. He said, "Go call your husband and come back and we'll talk about it." And that gets her to admit something about herself. I don't have a husband. And then Jesus digs into her life more. She says, "You're right. You don't have a husband. The man you're with now is not your husband. You've had 5 husbands. What you have said is true." And then she realizes that this Jesus guy has answers. Okay, so that's how that process works. Now, at this point, I think we've kind of made a whole bunch of points under this one point. The other issues that we need to talk about actually go a lot quicker. So this argument of Soren Kierkegaard really just touches on a wide array of things, and it's very difficult to briefly respond to it. Other than that, it's just a false dilemma. What we're going to do now is move on to this other point. The next argument in favor of Fideism is the argument. It's more of a philosophical argument, and what they say is, and I've heard this so many times from so many people, I've read it in books, Christian books, that proof eliminates freedom of the will. So they always give me an example of a quarter in the hand, and they say, all right, if I hold up both my hands to you and I tell you that the quarter is in my right hand, then it takes faith for you to believe the quarter is in my right hand. But if I hold both my hands out and I have the quarter in my right hand and I tell you it's in my right hand, it doesn't take any faith for you to believe it's in my right hand because you can see it's in my right hand. And then this is the kicker. They say, it's impossible for you to believe it's not in my right hand because my hand is open. And you can't help but believe it's in my right hand. Whereas if I had my hands closed, then you don't have proof it's in my right hand. So therefore you have the free will to believe it's in my left hand or my right hand. And what they're saying is, proof eliminates freedom of the will. Now, this is a very bad argument, and I've responded to it before, but I think I can do a better job this time. What this argument is talking about is like levels of justification. So like, there can be justification that's so strong that it's very difficult for you not to believe in something. So like, if I was to tell you that there's a full-grown elephant in your lap right now, you have such a strong body of evidence that that is not the case, that it's pretty much impossible for you to believe that the elephant is there. The justification you have, the evidence is so weighty that like, it'd be impossible for you to believe in the elephant. But you could, with effort, convince yourself that there is an elephant in your lap. You would have to go to deep levels of crazy, of psychosis, and it wouldn't be an easy process. But with enough time and enough effort, you could become crazy enough to believe. Like the guy, I talked to that believed that everyone has a God on their head and he can see them, and that means he doesn't have to eat or wear clothes anymore. So he has, through a long process, convinced himself of some very crazy things. But it takes time to do that. Now, that being said, there can be other types of justification that are not so obviously strong, but still rationally justify a belief. And the example I like to give is one that I heard the first time I ever heard this argument was on a CNN talk show. And, well, I won't go into details, but basically, this guy was an agnostic. He didn't believe in God. He said he doesn't know. And he made the argument of what's called hard agnosticism. He said it's impossible to know whether or not God exists because we can't possibly understand God. God is so far beyond our comprehension. How could we possibly understand God? Therefore, I don't believe in God because there's no way you could prove God exists because God is a concept beyond our understanding. And that argument, he really, went for that. And a lot of people have gone for that. I read a blog post where I listened to a video where someone else read the blog post from Bart Ehrman, because you can't read Bart's blog unless you pay Bart. But Bart Ehrman is a history professor, and he made that same argument that, like, he was arguing that, like, the leaf, the caterpillar lives on the leaf, and the world, the three-dimensional world beyond the leaf that the caterpillar lives on is so far beyond the caterpillar's understanding that the caterpillar can't possibly comprehend a world beyond the leaf. And he says, we're like that caterpillar, and God is like the world beyond the leaf. We can't possibly comprehend God, therefore it's impossible for us to ever know whether or not God exists, to ever have evidence or proof for God's existence, because we can't even comprehend the concept of God. That is bad reasoning, but it's not so obviously bad. It's what's wrong with it is you have to think about it and put some effort into it, into analyzing that argument, and then you'll see why it actually is a bad argument. But it's not obvious. It's not like there's no elephant in my lap right now. It's just so obvious that there's no elephant in my lap right now that I pretty much, the evidence compels me. It's impossible for me to believe in the elephant unless I work really hard at believing in the elephant. But when it comes to, like, there's no way we can know if God exists because God is beyond our understanding, that argument is bad. That's a bad form of reasoning. But it's not so obviously bad. You have to think about it. So, like, this argument is self-contradictory. It refutes itself. So, like, what it's saying is, I know that you can't know anything about God, but then that would be knowledge you are claiming to possess about God. How do you know that God's unknowable? Maybe God's knowable. How could you possibly know that? If God's unknowable, how could you possibly know that God is unknowable? You can't know that God's unknowable. Therefore, you have to conclude that it's impossible to know that God is unknowable. Therefore, we have to say it's always possible that God is knowable. We can't ever rule out the possibility. Therefore, this argument's bad. It's not just bad, it's a formal logical fallacy. There is no way it can be correct. It is, the possibility of it being correct is equivalent to 1 plus 1 equaling 542. It's logically impossible, but you had to think about it. And some people who've never heard the law of non-contradiction before and don't understand the logical fallacy of a self-refuting statement like that might have to pause this video and think about it for a second, because it kind of blows your mind the first time you hear it. But here's the thing. We know that this argument's bad, but it wasn't obviously bad. And obviously people have the free will to believe it, because people like Bart Ehrman or the guy on CNN years ago is named Bill Maher, believe it. They profess it. And yet, so they have the free will to believe in something, even though we can prove it wrong with the strongest level of proof I can give you. Proof that's really logically certain, that's stronger than the elephant in the lap thing. So my point is, justification can kind of be so obvious that like it removes free will without effort. But with Christian apologetics, we're not talking about that. We're not talking about that kind of justification. We're talking about stuff that you have to think about it. And what that means is that leaves it open for people to exercise. God is there for people who want to find Him. But if you want to reject God, you can reject Him. And He won't force Himself on you with obvious apologetics. But certain apologetics, strong rational justification, really indefeasible. I don't see how you can defeat some of these arguments for God's existence. You have to think about them. And so you can have an indefeasible argument or justification for your knowledge without having an obvious justification for your knowledge. And those aren't the same thing. So again, this is really another false dilemma. It's conflating obvious justification with indefeasible justification. Or even, it doesn't even have to be indefeasible. It just has to be strong enough that you're rationally justified, that you're warranted in believing it. That you would be irrational for rejecting it. If the evidence is that strong, then it's like, well, is it indefeasibly justified? No, but it's so strong that I would really be a fool for not believing it. So anyway, there you go. Now, other arguments in favor of Fideism. This argument I've heard before. Sometimes people will equate Christian apologetics with intellectual Christianity, and then they reject intellectualism in general, and so they'll reject apologetics and embrace Fideism on the basis of just a rejection of using your mind to think very much. All I want to point out with that is that there's no reason to make that conflation. There's no reason to equate Christian apologetics with intellectualism. And in reality, the levels of justification don't have to be all that intellectual. They can be fairly simple. When you just believe something because your parents believe it. Not because they told you to believe it, but because you can see that they believe it. Now let's take a look at the Bible verses themselves. In Matthew chapter 4, Jesus is tempted by Satan. And Jesus, at one point, Satan tempts Jesus, and, Jesus responds by defeating Satan by quoting a Bible passage where it says, "Don't test God." And, growing up, I heard this passage over and over and over again, saying that it is a sin for you to want proof of God's existence, because that's testing God, and the Bible says it's a sin for you to test God. And I always thought to myself, I was like, is that really what test means? I was like, well, I just take this guy's word for it. He's the authority and the educated one. But then I finally go back and look it up for myself. When Jesus says, "Don't test God," to the devil, he's actually quoting the Old Testament. And he's quoting a passage from the Bible, from the story of the Exodus. Not necessarily the book of Exodus, but from the story of the Exodus. And you understand what Jesus is talking about by looking into that story. And this thing is, this is a story of people who wanted, evidence from God, but they already had mountains of evidence from God. And, God was already performing miracles, these were the people of the Israelites who God had saved from Egypt with, multiple plagues. The miraculous plagues that He sent on the Egyptians, and the Hebrews were rescued. And then He brought them, He protected them with a wall of fire. And brought them through the Red Sea as it parted, and then drowned the Egyptians. And then He's giving them bread from the sky every day to feed them. And they're and then they begin to wonder, if he's really with them, and they want him to do something to prove that, not that he exists. They weren't that dumb. They weren't doubting God's existence, but just that he really is with them. They wanted a proof of his faith, I guess, in them, or that he was, on their side. But that's also ridiculous. Like, come on, you really doubting God at this point? Don't test the Lord your God. So it's not that there's something wrong with you for wanting proof. The point was that there's something wrong with you for wanting more proof. You already have mountains of it, and yet you still want more. A similar thing happens with Jesus, with the Jews in the New Testament. He's done enough miracles where they ought to believe that he's sent from God, and yet they want him to do more miracles, or they want to argue his theology. But he's defended his theology to the bone. There's nothing wrong with his theology, and there's nothing wrong, and it's clear that he's performed these miracles. It should have just taken one miracle from him, and all the Pharisees and Sadducees should have been on board with what he was doing. That's all. That was plenty of proof for them. Within their context, they had commands from God in the Old Testament that said, if someone is a prophet sent by God, they have to basically perform a miracle. Or alternatively, if they perform a miracle but they're sent in the name of another God, then they're not sent by God. So what that means is to prove someone's a prophet, A, they have to perform a miracle according to Jewish law, covenant with God, and B, they have to preach the correct God. And so the argument with Jesus was always, can you do another miracle? Many of the people asked Jesus to do more miracles all the time, and he had a problem with that because he's like, dude, I just fed 5,000 and y'all want me to make more bread. Don't y'all realize who I am? Haven't y'all accepted me for who I am? They turn around and leave him after that. All these followers he had, and he's fed the 5,000, and they're not with him when he's there, dying on the cross. They don't believe in him anymore. It doesn't make any sense. They start to leave him after. So, he feeds the 5,000, and then John chapter 6, he starts to preach some things that they don't want to hear, and they say this is a hard saying, who can understand it, and a lot of people leave him. And it's like, why are these guys, leaving him at this point? With the Pharisees and the religious leaders, their argument was not to deny the miracles, but to claim that the miracles were empowered by Satan and by false gods and that sort of thing. So that's what Jesus is talking about there. It's not saying that it's a sin for you to want evidence. Now the other one that I heard all the time was Hebrews 11:1, and with this one, I want to take the time to look up Hebrews 11. So Hebrews 11 is this faith chapter in the Bible. So Hebrews 11. All right. Now this is a New International Version. Hebrews 11:1 says, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for." So, growing up, I always heard this verse as defining faith as Fideism. Faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. So, they're saying belief without seeing means belief without evidence. And, immediately that raises questions like, there are different forms of proof. Like that version of agnosticism where it said you can't know if God exists. We disproved that, but we didn't disprove it by going and seeing, anything physically. We just logically saw that it was wrong. It's just logically wrong, Like I know 1 + 1 = 2 logically, not because, I have to every time I have to double check and pull out 2 rocks and put them there and count them. It's just logically that 1 + 1 = 2. So immediately that raises this whole interpretation of Hebrews 11:1 raises questions like, do not see might be not have anything to do with like proof. You know what I mean? It might be about trusting in God for something that He hasn't given you yet. And then if you read the rest of the chapter, that's what he's talking about, is trusting in things that you don't have from God. That, he's got all these examples. So he says, by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith Abel brought a better offering than Cain did. By faith he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith Abel still speaks even though he's dead. So, everything I've talked about with levels of justification and sort of a biblical definition of faith, a New Testament definition of faith, doesn't really disagree with any of this. As long as the rational justification for Christianity doesn't come to the point of compelling you to believe, of forcing you to believe in Jesus, then everything's fine. But that doesn't mean you don't have proof. But you have to think about it, and if you don't stay on your toes with reminding yourself of the good arguments for God's existence and etc., then you might start to wonder if you really have proof, And so, there's a faithfulness to apologetics, of mentally staying fit with these arguments and these things. But there you go. Based on the definition of faith that, the way I defined it before, it can go beyond the evidence or maybe the confidence level, because faith is an either or type thing, whereas your confidence level might be, down to 51%. But that doesn't mean you aren't rationally justified. That doesn't mean that we need to go to the point of straight Fideism. I don't know if there's anything I really can add to that. The only other argument I've heard in favor of Fideism is that Fideism, that apologetics doesn't convert people. And, this isn't really an argument in favor of Fideism, it's just more of an anti-apologetics argument. The short answer is apologetics, it does convert people. There are plenty of people who, it's a certain type of person who gets converted by apologetics. So, doing a ministry of apologetics is kind of like going to a certain part of the world and preaching to the people there. Except the people who are converted by apologetics don't live in a certain part of the world. There's some of them everywhere. But when someone like that is converted, they tend to be very converted, In addition to that, the Christian faith journey has doubt as part of the journey. And you can be helping Christians deal with their doubt. Because, all of these examples, verse 7 here says, by faith, in Hebrews 11, by faith Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By faith he condemned the world and became heir of righteousness that is in keeping with faith. So Noah gets told by God about the ark. Let's say that maybe Noah starts building the ark, and he has some rational justification that's at 100%. But let's say, because God came to him and told him. But let's say that another demigod comes, some other god comes, other supernatural being comes and tells him that it's not going to rain and there's not going to be a flood. Well, that would lower Noah's confidence level, because he saw Yahweh say it and he saw, Baal say it, or some, Marduk say it. And they both appeared to him. Well, that's going to lower Noah's confidence level. Maybe he'll get down really low to 51%. But maybe he could start doing some reasoning and some logical reasoning, and maybe there was something in something that Baal or Marduk said that didn't add up. It was flawed in some way. And as he did that, he basically was doing Christian apologetics. And he's starting to logically reason. And as he goes through that process, he may get his confidence level back up some. Maybe back up to 100%. So, I'm just giving sort of a hypothetical Noah example. I don't know how God appeared to Noah to tell Noah this. But if Noah's confidence level is really low, he's probably not going to be as faithful in his ark building. And so Christian apologetics can be helpful at making Christians more committed, more devoted, because they know that it's true. And whereas if they don't have those good reasons, sound, strong reasons for belief, then when doubts come their way, it may really shake them and slow them down in their Bible reading or going to church, or, or maybe just prayer. It's harder to pray when you start wondering if God exists, So or just being fervently dedicated to God. But my point is that I was making earlier is that for us to get sanctified at that point where we're fervently willing to build a boat because, God's going to kill everyone with a flood, that level of commitment and fervent commitment comes after we've dealt with our doubts. And it takes time to deal with those doubts. And you become this person who, has faith. And in Noah's case, it's not just a matter of his certainty, but he actually wanted it to happen, and he put his confidence in it. So it costs a lot of money to build that boat. It's huge and expensive, but he's putting his confidence in the boat. Because if it really does rain, that boat's going to come in handy. And he wants it to do. He wants it to happen. It's not that he's mad about it. It's not that he's the kid who's really upset about having to do what God said. He, in holy fear, built an ark to save his family. And by faith he condemned the world and became heir of righteousness that is in keeping with faith. So these examples for us really help us understand the concept of faith. It's not these people didn't have justification or evidence, Abraham and all this stuff. That kind of makes the point. This idea of faith as the gift of God of insanity, I think, goes beyond the pale. Whereas faith can go beyond evidence, but it's not like you don't have any rational justification, and it can be this faith journey that we walk with God on. It's not always the easiest thing in the world to believe in Christian apologetics arguments, because they're complicated and because you have to think them through. It doesn't mean that you're just forced to believe in Jesus, you know what I mean, against your will, or that it takes no effort, or that you don't struggle with doubt, because you wonder, maybe I made a mistake with the argument and I have to go back and rethink it through, and not just one argument for God's existence, but the entire panoply of all the evidences you have for Christianity. So you have to be faithful to thinking those things through. This is my criticism of Fideism. Specifically, the main criticism I would make of Fideism is that we have good arguments for God's existence and for the truth of Christianity and Jesus' resurrection for the dead. And so that doesn't fit within Fideism. It's but we can prove it. We do have the proof. So all they can do is stick their fingers in their ears at that point, and just say la 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 until we go away. But the arguments are there whether they like it or not. So Fideism is wrong whether you like it or not. That is a good stopping point as far as I am concerned. So let's stop. Thank you for your patience. Alright, so I listened to all of that. It took some time and decided there's something I would like to come in and add. I thought it would be a good idea to let's slow down and take a look at chapter 11 of the book of Hebrews, because it's talking about faith so much, and just sort of go through. It has this long list of examples, and sort of go through all of these and just analyze this when it comes to the Fideism question. So let's just do that. We're going to go through Hebrews 11. Alright, so like I said before, this was a proof text that a lot of people used when I was younger to prove Fideism true. I'm looking at the ESV, the English Standard Version here, and Hebrews 11:1 says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen," which doesn't sound like it has that, that proof text. But let's take a look at it. Hebrews 11. Alright. Here's an NIV. "Now faith is the confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." And then let's take a look at some of these other versions. I have a feeling that it was the New American Standard Bible that was the one. Yeah. Wow. "Now faith is the certainty of things hoped for, a proof of things not seen." Alright, and the version that I was familiar with was evidence of things not seen. It's got a footnote here on this one. It says, "or conviction about." So this is getting word interesting. Let's take a look in this particular word in more detail, because this Fideist argument hinged on this whole word. So what we'll do is we'll type in Hebrews, just HEB 11, into our search engine. Then I'm going to type in BLB, which will go to Blue Letter Bible. Okay. Hebrews 11, Blue Letter Bible. And it'll start out with the King James, but that'll be fine. The King James says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." And that word evidence, elekos, and it is not a Greek word, I know, but you can look up a bunch of information on this website. It's a noun, masculine noun. This word occurs 2 times in the New Testament. Wow! Okay, so it's translated as reproof, which means to basically put somebody down and show them how wrong they are, tell them what's up kind of thing. And then it's translated as evidence. Wow! A proof, that by which a thing is proved or tested. Alright, and they are looking at how it's used in other Greek texts, obviously. Other than the New Testament, which is written by Greek in Greek. So our other appearance of this text is 2 Timothy 3:16. "All Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness." Which, in that case, it would be like evidence. Okay. All right. So that's, based on that, it looks like the Fideists are giving we could go into more detail about this, but I don't know, it seems like the Fideists are right. Now the problem is that's a crazy turn of ideas for the Fideists, because what they're saying is that Hebrews 11:1 is saying that you don't need evidence. The faith itself, your faith itself is the evidence. That is not the same thing as having faith, believing in something without evidence. that is sort of turning it around and saying that, like, my belief is the evidence, which can be taken multiple ways. And I think the way they mean it is that, like, I don't need evidence, I just need faith, and my evidence is my faith. But that isn't really necessarily Fideism, that's like a little bit, to say that the faith is the evidence isn't really, that's what that's doing is that's saying that, like, a very interesting word game was being played. This is not a word game, but like some really artistic, creative use of language was going on here. And the problem with seeing this text in that way is that something incredibly elaborate like Fideism would have to be represented in kind of like a nifty, sort of cool way, where like sort of a fancy, smart saying, almost funny, or almost, I'm drawing a blank right now, but like, there are all kinds of little ways we have for saying things. I can think of biblical ones. I guess that's what's on my mind. So I use a biblical one. Here's one. You can't put the cat back in the bag, or the cat's out of the bag, that kind of thing. It's a metaphorical statement that we're talking about, once something's been said, you can't take it back, kind of thing. Or once an idea is out, once the little kids learn how to start cussing, you can't put that cat back in the bag. They know how to cuss, and they're going to be cussing. In the Old Testament, when the Hebrews are there at Mount Sinai, and it says that they made the golden calf while Moses was up on the mountain, and then it said they got up to dance and play. That was like a sort of a nifty little tongue-in-cheek euphemism for they were having a big orgy that was just common in the ancient world. And so my point here is, like, if they're saying that, like, faith is evidence, is, Hebrews 11:1, that's its way of affirming Fideism to be true. The problem with that is, like, well, that's a really fancy, like, that's sort of a proverbial cat's out of the bag, dance and play. It's all the way to proverb, fancy, nifty little cool saying form, and like, where's the more basic literal explanation of this? We're all the way up to, like, because under a Fideist view, faith would not be evidence, faith would be without evidence, but it's sort of a turning it around back in on itself, that, like, you don't really need evidence. This sort of the Fideist interpretation of that, and that's like, we've jumped all the way from, there's no text in the Bible that just kind of lays Fideism out and explains it to us, and we've jumped all the way up to, like, sort of a euphemism and a proverb, and, like, it's like a saying that people would say all the time that's familiar, that you oftentimes don't even say. Like, somebody says, "Oh man, I hope lightning doesn't strike the house. Knock on wood." Like, like, we just say that because it's all the way, you know what I mean when I say knock on wood, because it's such a common concept, but, like, that's because everybody already gets the idea. So it would be it doesn't make sense for the Bible to, like, talk about Fideism in this, like, very euphemistic, proverbial way, and never just lay it out plainly. So that would be a real problem for that interpretation. The more you think about it, the more obvious the problem is. So anyway, then the question becomes, like, well, what is it talking about? And that's really why I'm here, taking a look at this. My point I want to make is that faith is about belief, and it's about more than belief, but we won't talk about all of those other components. But what I want to make the point is that faith is about belief without having direct, obvious proof, but not necessarily lacking, rational justification, and therefore free will. So, like, and this is the basic point. I think really it's this philosophical problem we have with the whole idea of evidence, is where Fideism kind of gets its foot in the door. and this is what we've already talked about in this video, that you can have proof about something that is so obvious that it makes it really difficult for you not to believe that. Although you could convince yourself if you tried really hard, and you could basically have to go crazy. And you can also have proof that, like, makes it there's something to it, but, if we just kind of throw a number on it, we could say that, like, well, it's not 0% likely, it's 25% likely. Okay, well, then you've got something there, but still, if you're rational, you shouldn't believe it. And then you could say, well, okay, maybe we've got 51%. It's 51% likely. The justification's that strong, and it's like, okay, I guess then the rational thing to do, if we're really confident that it's 51%, is we have to believe it. Or you could have something that goes all the way to the level of, like, total logical certainty, where there's no way it's wrong, like 1 plus 1, equals 2. There's just no way that's wrong. So my point to you is these are different categories. Like, obviousness and the level of the strength of the justification are not the same thing. So, like, how would you prove that there's no elephants in the room right now? If you really wanted to prove it with absolute certainty, you would realize, like, I don't know if I can prove it with absolute certainty. Maybe there's, like, invisible elephants that don't smell and don't bump into things, and, like, it would be a problem to prove it with absolute certainty. But the evidence you have is so overwhelming that, like, you are rational for disbelieving in the existence of evidence of elephants in this room, and it's so obvious that, like, it'd be very difficult to believe in the existence of elephants in this room. And there is sort of a distinction between the strength of the justification for a belief and the obviousness of that justification. The strength and the obviousness, I guess, is, really the distinction that we need to make. And my point is that the evidence for God's existence and for Christianity, or for, say, for example, like the earth being round. Is the earth flat or the earth round? Well, the evidence we have that the earth is actually round is really, really strong and really good. Does it prove it to all the way 1 plus 1 equals 2 certainty? No. But you would be irrational to doubt that the earth is round because the evidence is so weighty. But when they first made that point, and it was around 500 BC, they had good evidence, and their evidence was so good and that they actually made estimates about the diameter or the circumference of the earth and the diameter of the earth, and they weren't off by much, which is amazing for 500 BC. That's basically, I'm just kind of giving, I don't know exactly when it was, but it was kind of around that era, because that's sort of a big date, a big time for all of the great leaps that the Greeks made. But the point is, it wouldn't have been obvious, even though it was really good evidence in 500 BC. But today, you have both, because it's also, you have obvious evidence, and the obvious evidence is the ubiquity of this belief, that, like, everyone believes it, and the only people you can find who don't believe it are kooks. So, like, that, the ubiquity of the belief, the overwhelming majority, the lion's share of people that believe that the earth is round. And so that in itself is a whole other form of evidence. It's basically testimony of, like, every teacher you've ever had, your parents, everyone you meet, and the only people you find who think it's flat seem kind of crazy. That is a whole other type of evidence that is sort of makes it, that's like obvious evidence. So now you would have to be kind of kooky. Maybe not full blown, thinking you transform into a penguin in the evening, crazy. But, like, you would have to be a little bit off your rocker to just say, oh yeah, all these people are wrong. But in 500 BC, you had strong justification, but you didn't have the overwhelming obvious justification for believing in a round earth, because you didn't have, it wasn't such a common belief. It took a long time for that to become a common belief. So maybe that kind of makes the point. And the added point about this is that there becomes an exercise of free will. If you want to reject God, you are not forced to accept God's existence. You are not going to be, really forced to do so. You have the freedom in this case. You can investigate the evidence if you want to, or reject it. And if you reject it, it's not going to be so obvious that it beats you over the head. But at the same time, if you're open and willing, if you're willing to seek God, you will find God, that kind of thing. And you will have good knowledge that God exists if you're open and honest. Jesus put it like this. Let's just take a look. Alright. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to John, the Gospel of John, chapter 7. And then we're going to bump out of the King James. Alright. Okay, now let's make sure I find the verse. John 7:17. Well, we'll go back to 16. Jesus answered, "My teaching is not my own, it comes from the one who sent me. Anyone who chooses to do the will of God will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own." So, I'll read it again. Anyone who chooses to do the will of God will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. Alright? Now, what we want to do is take a look at Hebrews 11, and we'll start in verse 2 now. There is one other thing I want to talk about other than this Hebrews 11 stuff. And I guess I better do it before we start digging into these examples. And it's just some philosophical ideas and concepts that are proposed and that are on the table. One by me and one by a very important philosopher by the name of Alvin Plantinga. So we'll do Alvin Plantinga's first. Alvin Plantinga's, he defends this thing called Reformed Epistemology. And I'm not going to go into long detail about it, but just kind of put this on the table. The question becomes like, why do people accept Jesus Christ and become Christians without learning all of these wonderful arguments we have for God's existence and the historical evidence? And the social science research says, it's based on testimony, and then there's sense of fit and moral virtue, and that's all well and good. Alvin Plantinga suggests there's something more going on. And what he says is people have a belief in God is a properly basic belief. So what does that mean? What it means is a basic belief is a belief that's not based on other beliefs. So like a basic belief, let's start with a belief that's not basic. A not basic belief would be like your belief that it's going to rain tomorrow. And that's not a basic belief. It's based on other beliefs. It's based on the weather report, and then, whether or not you believe the weather report is accurate. That kind of thing. Whereas a basic belief would be it's raining right now today because I'm standing outside and I look and it's raining on my head. I'm directly observing it. So I'm not basing that on other beliefs. So for example, you can believe that here's an example, that people who don't wear socks have smelly feet, and you can believe that Jimmy doesn't wear socks, and then you can believe, logically, that Jimmy has smelly feet. And the conclusion of that syllogism or that argument is not a basic belief because it's based on these other premises. It's literally but directly based on them. So it's a logical deduction based on premises. Whereas a basic belief would be something like the number 2 equals the number 2. You know, like you're not really, there's no chain of reasoning or putting anything together. You're just sort of directly observing an idea. And another example of a basic belief would be like if you're standing outside and getting rained on, it's raining on you right now. It's a basic belief because you're not basing it on other beliefs. You're just directly observing this information. Now, it's possible basic beliefs could possibly be wrong. You know, they're defeasible. They're not indefeasible. Now, 2 equals 2 is indefeasible. It's sort of way too simple to be wrong. You know, but like it's raining on me right now. It's possible that there's somebody somewhere, you know, that's got some water shooting out. You know, they make it look like it's raining in movies all the time, even though it's not. Maybe they could trick you somehow. You know, we've all mistakenly thought we saw things or heard things. You know, people have hallucinations and kind of things. So it's possible for basic beliefs to be wrong, so they're defeasible. But at the same time, you are, unless you have a good defeater for your basic belief, you are rationally justified in holding that belief. And I won't go into all of the, you know, the argument and evidence about that. I did in a past video, and that video is called... it's a recent video I did about the evidence for morality. All right, bringing it up. Coming up. And we got it. All right, it's called Defense of Moral Knowledge. 16 views. So somebody watched it, I guess, or clicked on it at least. We talk about why you are rationally justified in, like, if you see an apple on a table, you're rationally justified in believing there's an apple on a table, unless you have a good defeater, a good reason to think that that's not really an apple. Like, there's really, really convincing, you know, wooden or plastic apples, you know. So, like, Alvin Plantinga's point is that belief in God's existence could actually be a direct sense experience. He calls it the sensus, I'm not good with Latin, divinitatis, I think. Or like the sense of God, that we could have this actual direct sense of God. So, I don't think he means that, like, this is something everyone has, but rather this would be something that, like, is God gives to people to, like, as part of the conviction of the Holy Spirit. I don't know. There's a lot of debate back and forth about it. The primary objection to his argument is called the Great Pumpkin Objection, which says, well, why isn't Charlie Brown or Linus from the Charlie Brown cartoon rationally justified in believing in the Great Pumpkin? And then there's all kind of responses to that. I don't think the Great Pumpkin Objection is a good one, but anyway, there's that. And the point is, like, if he's correct, then Christians just directly sense God, and so it is based on evidence, and very much in the way that, like, you know, so in other words, if the Fideist says that the only way to come to God, the only way to believe in God is without evidence, Alvin Plantinga would say that, like, that's like telling somebody who's standing outside in the rain that the only way to believe it's raining right now is without evidence. And it's like, what are you talking about? You're a kook. Like, I just directly sense this. Now, let's switch gears and we'll talk about my little idea that I like. My argument is that in Romans 1, it says that the creation proves the existence of the Creator. And so, if I take that and kind of run with it, I'm like, well, now, wait a minute. The creation means everything other than God. So, like, the planet Alpha Centauri is something God created. The birds that poop on your car hood are something God created. You know, your toenails. Literally everything you've ever experienced in your life, other than God directly, would be evidence of God's existence. And so, I take that and I just say, all right, let's just assume that that's true. That Paul's correct about that. then I add another premise. So premise 1 would just be Paul, Paul in the Bible says that like absolutely everything is evidence for God's existence. He says, well, basically God's existence. We won't go into detail. And then the second premise of this argument would just be that it is possible for humans to know things without being able to explain them. And that one is obviously correct. Like we all experience that all the time. The most obvious example is like something you experienced, what an experience was like. Something that was funny. I don't know how, a lot of us, experience things that are really, really funny when they happen, and we try to go tell somebody what happened, and it's not funny when we tell it because we're not really good at explaining what was so funny about it. And that's why comedians make lots of money, because they're good at that. And the rest of us can't make millions of dollars as comedians. These people make millions of dollars because they're good at explaining something that happened and what was funny about it. Now sometimes they take it and make it funny, but sometimes they're just explaining what was so funny about it. And a lot of us experience that, like something happens, it was so funny, and then I try to explain it, and when I explain it, it's not funny, because it's very difficult, or it doesn't come across the right way to other people, Our feelings, our emotions are very difficult to explain. The wonder and excitement, when you go, like, I remember one time, somebody I knew came back from a vacation, and he was trying to explain to me like how cool it was, like the stuff he saw, and he was showing me pictures, and it was just like I could tell he thought it was amazing, but it seemed kind of dumb to me, like and I was wondering, like, if I was there, would I think it was dumb, or is he just not able to explain what was so cool about it? Yeah, I don't know. But if you take those two premises, one, that everything you've ever experienced is proof of God's existence, and two, that it's possible to have a hard time explaining something that you know, then therefore it is possible for Christians to have lots of proof for God's existence that they can't explain. In fact, if premise 1 is true, then the conclusion would be likely to be true. It would actually be likely that you can't explain the evidence, because it wouldn't be just one argument, one piece of evidence, or one logical argument. It would be everything you've ever experienced. So it would be very difficult to like sum all that up in a simple little argument. Like, no, I can't ever sum all that up. It's kind of like the example G.K. Chesterton made years ago about what if someone wanted to argue with him and wanted him to prove why civilization is better than anarchy? And he said, the problem is there's no one reason. If any one reason I give you, you can argue against that one reason and make a convincing argument against that one reason. The problem is it's not one reason. It's lots and 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 lots. It's an overwhelming number of reasons. So the best philosophy is done slowly, and sometimes people want you to make a quick argument and then they can quickly defeat it, and there's a hidden implication that they think that like reasoning and evidence can all be done incredibly fast, when in reality sometimes there's like mountains of evidence and mountains of arguments pro and con that need to be weighed before so anyway, that is a way people try to manipulate and abuse and trick right there, all the time. But, so I've got those two out there on the table. If either of those or both of those are correct, then, like, Fideism is wrong. And it would be true that people have a hard time explaining why. They can't really give you, like, a reason why they believe what they believe. But at the same time, that doesn't mean they don't have evidence. That doesn't mean the average Christian may be just kind of just like know that God exists without being able to explain how they know it. Like, that's totally plausible. And in fact, if Romans 1 is true, then it's likely. and there would actually be more arguments for God's existence than the ones that we have. We've just teased out a little bit of the overall case for God's existence. So, now we can get into Hebrews. Oh my goodness, how far into this are we? 30 minutes in. We'll just see how this goes. Hebrews 11:2, it says, alright, now, just for 11:1. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction or the evidence of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. Alright? By faith we understand that the universe was created by the Word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. Now the Fideists would interpret that and say that, like, we just know that because we just believe it without evidence. But I can make a counter argument that, like, it took faith in God for me to analyze the good arguments for the creation of the world and to come to know that. Okay? So that took faithfulness from me. And, it's also possible for me to, like, Christian apologetics and analyzing these arguments is it's like working out. It's like a mental workout. If you don't do the workouts regularly, you will lose all of your physical fitness, So, like, if you can train all your life and become, like, the Olympic champion of, like, every sport, or whatever, and then you can say, all right, well, I'm super physically fit, so now I'm not going to exercise ever, and I'm going to eat whatever I want, then you won't be physically fit anymore. It'll all go away. But the same thing is true mentally. They give you degrees in school that say that, like, you knew this at one time and that's all it takes to get the job. In reality, like, if you don't stay up on that stuff and relearn, then, like, you're not going to remember it if you don't use it all the time. So the brain, as the old saying goes, the mind is a muscle and it has to be exercised. So the same thing is true with Christian apologetics. Like, I may have gone through good arguments for the creation of the world and the fact that God created the world. One of the good ones is the Kalam cosmological argument, and I may have gone through it and had it, like, down nailed, and really been rationally justified in believing that God created the world, and then I could turn around and, like, never study it, never think about it again, and given years and decades, I might begin to wonder if there was some big hole in it. Maybe someone could come to me and I won't remember exactly how the argument worked, and I might have my doubts. So it takes faithful re-looking through it, for me. So I don't see, this isn't a problem if we understand that, like, there's a difference between strength of justification and obviousness of justification. Okay. Now, let's keep going. It says, by faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain. But the point, I guess one more point we need to make about verse 3 there, is we do have good arguments for God creating the universe. So, like, that is a problem for the Fideist interpretation of that verse by itself. Okay? Anyway, let's take a look at verse 4 here. It says, by faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts, and through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. By faith, Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death. We do the Abel. Now, here the issue is, where was this faith aspect? Abel was offering to God the best animals from his flock. He was a shepherd. He kept herds, and he offered the best animals. And the thing about, that is, like, you want to, keep the healthiest female. Well, basically, in a herd, you want to keep all the females alive as long as you can until eventually you have to slaughter them and eat them. And then the males, you're going to castrate all of them except for the absolute best one or ones. And you're going to have to keep them in a pen separate. And then when you want to impregnate the females, you always want to impregnate them with the strongest males. Because over time, like say, for example, back when farming first originated, it wasn't actually better than hunting as far as a way of getting food. because the animals had not been bred to be more food productive. Like sheep didn't have wool. It took thousands of years to like breed sheep to like have wool. You know, animals get sick and die. They don't put on as much growth, and there's not as much food production. You know, they don't make as much milk, and so he's taking, you know, by giving to God like the best of the flock. That's trusting in God to take care of him, and he's not taking care of himself. So it takes faith in God to do that. Now, the Fideists would say, and that faith was without evidence. But I don't think that's the case. I mean, like, how did they know that God accepted one sacrifice and didn't accept another? It doesn't say. But it's clear that, like, there was a physical manifestation of God's presence. And afterwards, when Cain is upset that God didn't accept his sacrifice, he actually has a conversation with God. So we're talking about people who are physically in the presence of God here. The sons of Adam and Eve, who have conversations with God. So they have some evidence. You know what I mean? This is not Fideist. That's a leap to say that, like, because I mean, like, if it under a Fideist perspective, there's no physical presence of God. So how do you know that Abel offered a sacrifice that God accepted and Cain didn't? How did they come up with that? That was just one person's opinion versus another. There's no God to come in and decide, you know, who was right. It says, by faith Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Now before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. So Enoch was a man who God just took up into heaven and he didn't die. And it says here that the reason why is because he was such a good man. So again, he was faithful to obey God. And it takes faith, you know, in God and in God looking out for you to like obey God sometimes, because there's a lot of situations in life where it would benefit you to disobey God. And like, you know, if you can tell someone a lie, it can be very beneficial for you sometimes. If you can get away with it, if you can steal something, if you can not help someone in need. But God wants you to be selfless. God wants you to give. God wants you to tell the truth. God wants you to do all these things, like not steal. Nonetheless, like, again, in Enoch's case, like, he knows God exists. He is literally taken up to heaven by God. And he's only a few generations removed from Abel and Cain and Abel here. Now in verse 6 it says, and without faith it is impossible to please him, meaning God. For whoever will draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. Which is true. Okay? It says, by faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of righteousness that comes by faith. And we talked about the Noah example already, and I sort of introduced, like, what if another false god came in and, like, you said, the devil, came in and told him to not build the ark. Noah would have to do some reasoning about that, But there's no reason for him to think that it would just be blind faith. I mean, like, building the boat, because God spoke to him. It's not without any evidence. It's not like, the Noah example is good, because, like, how would Noah know to build this ark? How would he even, where would he get the idea to build it unless God had, like, actually spoken to him? And a lot of people consider hearing the audible voice of God, or seeing God and God coming to you and speaking to you, would be evidence of God's existence. Okay? Or that someone or something exists. And as it says, and without faith it is impossible to please God, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. And that's sort of, like, obviously true. Like, that second part of that sentence, how could you draw near to God if you don't believe God exists? You can't. And you have to believe that God rewards those who seek Him. So, like, why would you, make sacrifices for God's sake if you don't believe that God's looking out for you and going to take care of you? And so then, how could you, please God? You have to hold fast to these beliefs. There has to be some sort of conviction in you that, like, you really believe these things. And we talked about it, like, faith in a biblical sense means that, like, you're putting your butt in the chair and you're, like, you want it to be true, and you also that you just plain believe it. And that means it can kind of go beyond the evidence in a way, but because, like, you either have faith or you don't, Alright, so I don't know what we could say. It's just the Fideist interpretation runs into problems. It says, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. So again, he's trusting in God, but it's not without any evidence. He says he was called. God spoke to him. By faith he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past this age. Now remember, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. Here's the thing. They had this child. When God came and said it was going to be Sarah that was going to have the child, remember, Sarah was in the tent. She laughed at God. But she was also, like, baking bread for God to eat. And the men who were with him. And then there's the whole episode where God's like, okay, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham's like, really, God? Like, what if there's some good people there? And, like, God makes it clear that, like, there's, like, less than 10. And he saves just Lot's family. And then, like, fire rains down from the sky, destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. After you have this conversation, a lot of people would believe in God at that point. So, I mean, believing in God's existence when you're baking bread for Him, and you're hiding because you don't want Him to hear what you hear you laughing, but then He hears you laughing. Of course you think He exists, but will He keep His promises? Well, that's based on A, does He have the ability to keep His promises? Is He powerful? And B, does He have the moral, the relationship you have with God? But to learn that God, like, is someone faithful in your relationship. For one thing, you can use logical arguments and evidence to, like, learn that God will be a morally perfect being. But in addition to that, you can look at the other people who believe in God, the people who wrote the Bible, who, what they experienced. But in addition to that, you can have a relationship with God where you begin to learn what God's like. God could, trust could be, just like any relationship with any person, you learn to trust the person the more you live with them and do things with them. But that relationship has to be pursued. And the same things with God and with Sarah with God. She could have just been ignoring God and not baking the bread and not even listening to what He had to say. And then she wouldn't learn about God and gotten to know God any better. So it took a little bit of faithfulness for her. All right. It says, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. In other words, like, Abraham and Sarah received things from God, but they were also believing in things that weren't going to come until after they died. This nation, these descendants, in the land. if they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. Alright? It says, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. So in other words, God has promised to Abraham, it says here, he considered that God was able to even to raise him from the dead, which figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Okay? So like God made these promises that Isaac's children are going to be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and then God tells Abraham to kill Isaac. And so Abraham, before he had any kids, so Abraham deduces that, well, God must be going to bring him back from the dead. And that's what it says right here. But again, this was a child that was a miracle baby anyway. But it takes faith to believe in a bonus miracle, right? But it's not faith without evidence. And that's kind of the point, that like God kind of ups the game, but he doesn't you're not going based on nothing. Because, I mean, the problem with Fideism is, like, well, why be Christian instead of something else? Like, if you're just going to believe in something for no evidence, why don't I just, be the liberal Christian and just rip pages out of my Bible for no reason at all? Because I decided that's what I believe for no reason at all. Certain pages are in my Bible, and then maybe I'll glue in some extra pages that I want in there. And I believe that for no reason at all. Okay, let's see. He says, by faith Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau, which is essentially he's functioning as a prophet there. He prophesied about what was going to happen between Jacob and Esau and the nation of the Edomites and the Israelites. And it said similar thing happened. It says, by faith Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. By faith Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. So these people are functioning as prophets. We don't know where they got the prophecy from, but like, did they just make it up? Well, I don't think so. But he's believing in something, like Joseph's believing in something that would happen centuries later. Okay? That he didn't have. So in other words, like, if God says he's going to give you a gold bar, it takes faith to believe it. Even if God appears before you and he's proven himself a reliable, trustworthy person, if you don't have the gold bar in your hand, then you do have to exercise some faith to believe that God's going to do that. But if you have the gold bar in your hand, it's so hard for you to disbelieve in the gold bar that it doesn't take anything on your part to believe. There's nothing required of you there. Okay? Because the gold bar is literally in your hands. It'd be hard for you not to believe in the gold bar. Okay, it says, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Again, similar thing. This is giving us information like, where did they get this, Apparently they knew that God was going to help them somehow, or God had led them, maybe deep in their soul kind of thing. It says, by faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater than greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking forward to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. I'm pretty sure he's talking about when they left Egypt, and Pharaoh then sent the army to kill him and all the Israelites, the actual Exodus. But he had faith that God, was going to take him through that, and God took him through the Red Sea. By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. So God tells Abraham, Moses, the firstborn of every child is going to die, but, uh, you kill a lamb and put the blood over your doorpost and you'll be okay. It takes faith to do that, to believe that. Even at the point with Moses, obviously God exists. God has spoke to Moses audibly, literally, and God's proven himself with Moses on many occasions. But it takes faith to continue to trust God for this extra thing. So like it's just like a relationship you have with a person. Like they exist, and through your relationship with them, you know their character and what they're like, and whether or not they're going to do what they say they're going to do. The relationship with God's a little different because God always does what He says He's going to do. I heard a funny saying from William Lane Craig in his book. He was talking about his journey, but getting into the ministry that he was into, and he has a saying that he got from his wife, and his wife said, "God is always almost late," which is a very funny turn of phrase. It means God is exactly on time. He's not late or early. He arrives precisely on time. But it's just funny. He's almost late, which that's exactly on time. Yeah. All right. I guess more with the Exodus. It says, by faith the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. All right. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. God tells you you're going to just take this city. And, these are the same people that have been going through the Sinai, the desert, with bread falling from the sky and all that. And that He parted the river Jordan for them to cross. There have been miraculous victories with them in war where, like, as long as Moses holds his hands up, they win. They were cursed with the scorpions or something, or no, the snakes came and bit them, but then they looked at that snake on the pole and they were all cured. But the normal way to take it, like if I was living back then and I wanted to take Jericho. Now Jericho was not a city, it was a military base. Okay, which would have, a lot of people living there that weren't in the army, but they were like Rahab the prostitute, for the soldiers. She's not really a soldier, she's a prostitute for soldiers, But like, it says, by faith Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had given friendly welcome to the spies. They found Jericho. It was a military base, as a fort. And so like if I had like bombs or like tanks, it wouldn't take a whole lot of faith for me to believe that I could take the fort. Or if like the walls were made of paper mache, it wouldn't take a lot of faith for me to believe I could take the fort. But like, it would take faith for me to like believe that I could walk around the wall for 7 days singing a worship song to God, and then the walls would just fall down of their own accord. That would take a lot of faith for me to believe that. But it's not like there's no evidence. It's not like they have no evidence to base this faith on. Nonetheless, if they want to take the route of being a poo-poo head and ignoring the evidence, they could. Okay? And then they don't. It's not compelling. It doesn't force you to believe. And that's the last of his examples. He just goes in and he says, oh, there were so many more examples. But that wraps it up. So now this video is really long. But I guess we talked a whole lot about Fideism. So if you're still with us, thank you for your time.